Hey everybody, and welcome back to Neuroscience. If you're a returning viewer, thanks for coming back. Nice to see you again. And if you're a new viewer, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to be talking about concussions in another Neuroscience ABCs lecture, which we have entitled C is for Concussions. Sit tight because we're going to be talking about what concussions are, how they happen, their signs and symptoms, how we can detect concussions, and how we can treat them. Concussions are a type of mild traumatic brain injury which can be caused by an impact to the skull, or they can be non-impact injuries caused by a jolt of the head. For instance, if you experience whiplash, this can result in a concussion. The way it happen is, let's just think of this cup as your skull. The water inside it is your cerebrospinal fluid, and the ice in the glass would be your brain. If I jolt the cup back and forth, the ice ends up hitting the cup. Within your skull, the same thing can happen. If you hit your head or experience a jolt of your head, your brain can end up smashing up against the bone of your skull. This causes damage to the neurons within the brain. It can cause tearing of axons, and when this happens, the neurons actually release toxins into the brain as well, which causes further neurodegeneration. Now when this happens, the brain actually ends up hitting typically the front of the skull, but also it rebounds and hits the back of the skull as well. So this results in two injury points called the coup injury, which is right at the front, and the contre-coup, which is when your brain would recoil and end up hitting the back of the skull as well. After experiencing head trauma like this, some of the signs and symptoms that the individual has a concussion would be things like drowsiness, dizziness, sensitivity to light, problems balancing, depression, moodiness, feeling tired but also inability to sleep, headaches, slowed reaction time, and irritability. Now, if you are experiencing any of these symptoms, you should go see your doctor right now. And remember that Neuroscience is just for educational purposes, and we are not here to diagnose or treat any issues you may have. So typically when a person suffers from a mild traumatic brain injury, they would go to the doctor. The doctor would ask them questions such as, are you having any headaches? Are you tired? When was the last time you felt dizzy? Stuff like that to help them figure out whether the person has a concussion or not. Now the problem with this is that these are highly subjective symptoms, and oftentimes when people experience this, for instance the feeling of being in a fog, they might think, oh, it's just all in my head, maybe I'm tired, and deny the fact that they probably have a concussion. With that in mind, doctors and scientists are working on ways to diagnose concussions more objectively. The problem is things like MRI and CAT scans don't reveal any differences when comparing concussed individuals to non-concussed individuals. Luckily though, DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, shows that people with concussions actually have differences in white matter. Now, diffusion tensor imaging works by measuring the flow of water within the brain, and this actually helps predict the organization of the white matter. So what we see with DTI in concussed individuals is that they actually have higher rates of diffusion. So this means that there's more water diffusing throughout the brain, and also the diffusion doesn't happen in an organized manner. Typically diffusion would happen along the white matter tracts, but in concussed individuals there's actually a lower fractional anistropy, which is just a measure of how organized the diffusion of water is throughout the brain. So if you have a higher fractional anistropy, there's more organization, but in concussed individuals it's lower, so rather than water diffusing within white matter, it's actually quite disorganized. On top of that, the mean diffusivity is also higher, which means overall there's just more water diffusing throughout the brain. So it's less organized and more water is diffusing, and this suggests suggests that there has been an altered microstructure within the brain, and also that there's degeneration and demyelinization of axons. Along with that, scientists have used EEG to detect concussions, which is electroencephalography. We've talked about electroencephalography a little bit in previous lectures, which you can find above. But basically what they see in concussed individuals is that there's changes in frequency and altered spectra of the brain waves within concussed individuals. Knowing this, scientists in 2018 used EEG in combination with neurocognitive tests to develop a multimodal analysis for concussion, which they called the Enhanced Multimodal Brain Function Index. Now, while some scientists have opted to use imaging techniques, other scientists have opted to look for biomarkers such as proteins and genetic markers within the brain that can help to identify whether an individual has sustained a concussion or not. One protein, for example, is the tau protein, which is actually a very important marker for Alzheimer's disease, has also been shown to increase in concussion patients. So this is a protein associated with a neurodegenerative disorder that has also been shown as a flag for concussions. Along with that, we have the S100B protein, which is the S100 calcium binding protein. This is an important astroglial protein that has been shown to be elevated in concussed individuals. This is a protein important for axonal proliferation, so perhaps it is elevated in an attempt to promote healing within the brain. Along with that, scientists have opted to look at epigenetic mechanisms such as histone modification. And one study that was just published on January 1st this year used artificial intelligence and deep learning to detect whether there were certain methylation sites on the genome that can help predict concussion. And they actually found that there was methylation of 4 distinct cytosine residues that was a predictor of concussions. That being said, these residues were methylated in greater than 90% of the concussed individuals, so they can serve as an important flag for concussions. Now you might be wondering, why is it important when we can just ask somebody how they're feeling and figure out that they have a concussion based on what happened? It's actually very important to develop biomarkers because when you think of it, if a child or baby sustains a concussion, we can't ask them how they're feeling, and being able to have a more objective way of measuring this can help us make sure they get the treatment they need. With that being said, let's move on to the discussion of our final question, and that is how to treat an individual with a concussion. Now, usually when somebody is concussed, they will go to the doctor, and the doctor will tell them to rest, sleep, and just wait it out. There is no cure for a concussion, but when you think of it, there's no cure for a broken bone other than rest as well. And it's often hard to think of our brain as being injured, but that's really what happens with a concussion. So the only way to get over it is by giving it time. Typically, people start with full rest for the first week, and then they'll try to work in half-hour intervals, half an hour of trying to read something, and then half an hour complete rest. Basically, the patient has to wait until their brain recovers. Just like if you broke your leg, you'd have to wait and rest until your bone heals. So just because you can't see the injury doesn't mean it's not there. Because if you get a concussion and then try to go immediately back to doing whatever you usually do, that would be like trying to run a marathon on your broken leg, which is ridiculous. So I think at the end of the day, you get the point that concussions are actually a serious matter, and you have to take care of your most important organ, your brain. A lot of people don't do this, but the fact is that even subconcussive blows to the head can lead to a neurodegenerative disorder called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the buildup of tau proteins within the brain causing neurodegeneration, which leads to mood swings, dementia, memory loss, change in personality. These can all appear pretty early on in life. So take care of your brain. It's the most important organ in your body. And if you want to learn more about it, or if you just want a fun movie to watch tonight, You can learn about chronic traumatic encephalopathy by watching the movie Concussion, starring Will Smith as Dr. Bennett Omalu, a neuropathologist, and you can see their journey on bringing chronic traumatic encephalopathy to light of the media. That's all for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions about concussions or anything else neuroscience related, make sure you leave them down below. Comment, subscribe, like this video, and share it with all your friends. We'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.